All right, guys, I hope you are all having a great week. So today we're going to have our second lecture in our AAC series. Last week we talked about the first three topics on this slide. So communication development, the difference between form, function, content, and then we talked a little bit about differentiating between aided versus unaided communication. So as a reminder, our form is our type of communication. So how are our students communicating? Are they using manual sign? Are they using pictures? Our function is why, or why. Okay, so what's their intent? What's their reason? Do they need help? So are they requesting? Are they refusing an item that they don't actually want? And then finally, our content is the what. So what exactly are they trying to communicate about? So today we're going to talk about um, aided communication and several different considerations within that. So these are the 6 topics that we're going to discuss today regarding aided communication. So within aided communication, there are different forms that are used, and there's really 3 main types or categories. So the first will be non-electronic devices, which is exactly what it sounds like. You guys have probably all used non-electronic devices in regards to aided communication in your classroom. So this is something as simple as pictures. So let me pull up an example. So a communication board that might look like this, right? So we have basic images, I want, okay, more, yes and no, and then objects or things that a student might commonly want. So I want a book, I want help, I want to eat, etc. Now with our non-electronic devices, our devices essentially can be freestanding, they're easily portable, and they're things that we can display in a variety of locations. Another form of a non-electronic aided communication would be an eye gaze board. So I have 2 videos that we're going to watch. So this first video shows a very simple use of an eye gaze board. If you take a look here, you see the eye gaze board is really just clear plastic. There's a hole in the middle, which is kind of hard to see right now, but you can see when the video comes up. And this teacher is just using it to simply have the students select between 2 items. So let's take a look. And we have crackers. Okay. So I will show you what kind of crackers we have and what kind of granola bar we have. What would you like to eat? Would you like the granola bar or would you like the crackers? You're looking at the granola bar. You want to look at me if you want the granola bar? Look at me, Tegan, if you want the granola bar. You want that? You might be looking at the screen there.
Hello, gorgeous.
You see this? Would you like that or would you like your crackers? You tell me which one you want. You're looking at your granola bar. You look at me if you want your granola bar. Yes? Okay, excellent. All right, I'll have granola bar for snack. Okay, so if you notice, the teacher used the 2 corners to visualize the snacks for the students. So on the little symbols here, she has the AAC for each of the snacks. So a picture of a granola bar, a picture of crackers. She held up the actual items, had the student gaze at the item, and then look back at her through this center hole to verify that that's what she's wanting. So that's a really simple way to use an eye gaze board. A little more complex way, and I'll show you that right here, is called an E-Tran, so an eye transfer communication device. And these are done differently by different people, but here's an example of how you could use that. Start this video in the middle just for the sake of time. We actually have an E-Tran board on campus, and I will show you guys this in person the next time that we meet face to face.
Now, let's learn how an E-Tran board works. We are going to spell the word my together. First, the user gazes at the group containing the letter M. The partner watches the user's eyes and calls out the color of the group at which the user is gazing. The partner would call out green. There are many letters in each group, so unless the user wants the letter within the group that matches the group color, he must make a second selection to show his partner the color of the letter he's selecting within that group. The M is purple, so the user now gazes at the purple dot. The partner will call out purple. The partner now knows it is the purple letter within the green group and calls out M. In other words, the first eye movement selects the group, and the second eye movement selects the color of the letter within the group. Let's try the next letter, Y.
Okay, so that was just a quick example of what an E-Tran board looks like. Obviously, students have to be able to spell in order to use the E-Tran board in that format that we saw. Like I said, we do have one on campus, and I'll show you guys how that works, and we can practice with that some. It's a great way to work with some of our non-vocal students. So our second group would be dedicated communication devices. So this is talking more about AAC devices that are more specifically designed for communication as a primary function. So these might be equipped with environmental control, computer accessibility features, things like that. They range from devices that are designed just to provide a few messages, such as a Big Mac or a Cheap Talk. I have a picture of a Big Mac for you guys. Um, so this is what a Big Mac looks like if you have never seen one. Again, we have these on campus as well. And then it might range to a more complex device, such as a Dynavox. So this is what a Dynavox looks like. It's a little bit more complex. There are many more messages that a student can use as far as communication on a Dynavox, where the Big Mac is simply programmed to communicate just a simple few messages. And then lastly, we have computer-based, Windows-based communication devices. So these are devices that are more like laptops. There's standard or alternative input options, and with the use of communication software such as Speaking Dynamically Pro. So these are our students who have much more complex, complicated devices that are hooked through computers. So those are the three main types of aided communication in regards to form. Now, when talking about symbol considerations, it's really important to remember that the type of symbol that we choose to use is really dependent on the sensory needs of our students. In addition, what are the cognitive skills of our students? For example, if we're working with students who are deaf and blind, we obviously are going to need to use much more tangible symbols to accommodate the higher sensory needs of those students. So when you're talking about tangible symbols or 3D symbols, these are objects of 3D items that are used to communicate. So you can have an entire object, which might be, let's say we're teaching the student to communicate they want breakfast. So in the entire object, we might have an entire cereal box that student uses to indicate that they would like to eat cereal. When we're looking at a partial object, maybe we just have cut out the front of that cereal box. So instead of having the whole Fruit Loop box, now we have just the partial of the object, which is just the front of the Fruit Loops box, and that's sufficient for that student to communicate they would like cereal. Now, an associated object might be something like a bowl or a spoon. Okay, so we're getting a little bit further away from that exact concrete object of the physical cereal box that they want to an associated object, which is a tool they use to consume the cereal. And then finally, we look at what would be a more abstract object. So maybe there's a rectangle shape that represents a cereal box, and that student knows that that shape represents what they want for breakfast. So object symbols are often the easiest type of symbols for our students to learn because they more closely resemble the actual object. So further considerations in regards to symbols include things such as whether or not you would use an identical object versus a non-identical object. For example, if we're continuing to talk about cereal selection, do you need to use the Fruit Loop box, which is the identical type of cereal that the student eats, or could you use any cereal box? So if you had a Raisin Bran cereal box, would that symbol be sufficient for that student to communicate that they wanted their cereal? We know that some students, yes, it would. Some students, it wouldn't. So again, coming back to the sensory and cognitive levels of those students, what do they specifically need? When you're talking about using photos, do you need to use a colored photo or a black and white photo? Okay. Some students, a black and white photo will be sufficient, and some students it will not. If you've ever worked with students with logo identification and you've printed logos off in a black and white version and a color version, Sometimes students will not recognize that same logo if it doesn't have the logo colors on there. Okay? So important things to consider. Some teachers will use miniature objects. This is particularly a good strategy when you're working with students who have impaired vision or other impaired senses. So a small object that represents what they're trying to communicate. I've even actually seen like small little plastic toilets that represent restroom for students who need that. So it's much more tactile. They can touch it, they can feel it. It has a 3D shape to it. So those are what the miniature objects are. Um, Colored versus black and white line drawing symbols. Okay? Black and white line drawing symbols are going to be much more abstract for our students and a little bit harder um, to understand and communicate with if the student has a bit lower of a cognitive level. Bliss symbols, I'll show you what bliss symbols are. I've actually never come across a student who uses bliss symbols. But it's a very abstract symbol system in which different symbols represent different words. So here are just some examples of some. So if you take a look, obviously, if this is the symbol for person, this really doesn't look anything like a person. So much more abstract for students. But this is a system that some individuals, my apologies, some individuals with physical health needs and severe speech needs will use to communicate. And then finally, whether you would just simply use written words for students, and that is an option for those students who are readers. Okay. So in addition to the considerations you have in regard to the form of the symbol, there are also other dynamics that have to be considered. And these mainly relate to how a untrained observer would be able to understand the communication of the symbol. So iconicity is the degree that a symbol or sign resembles what it represents. Okay, so a photo of an object is much more representative of that object than a bliss symbol would be, which are those symbols I just showed you. Okay, so a non-trained observer would not recognize the bliss symbol for a person, most likely. However, if the student showed that non-trained observer a picture of a person, it's much more clear what that student wants. Transparency is how easily an untrained observer can guess the meaning of the symbol. So based on the shape, the motion, or the function, can I guess what that symbol means when it's showed to me? So again, the more tangible of an object you have, the more transparent that symbol is for an untrained observer. And once you get to more abstract symbols, the harder it's going to be for an observer to understand. And then finally, translucency is how guessable the relationship once the relationship between the symbol and the referent are explained, um, can that observer then figure out what the student wants. Now, in addition to discussing the untrained observers, the impact of these on untrained observer, we also must consider the student. So these concepts also apply. For example, we may think that using let's say, an open cup to represent that the student wants to drink. That's pretty transparent, right? If a student were to hand you a cup, you would probably assume that they wanted to drink. However, we as educators can't assume that because we put a cup in front of a student who is nonvocal, they will automatically assume that that cup represents drink. Um, it seems very transparent to us, but we can't assume that. That student maybe hasn't ever had a drink from an open cup. It may be that they've never had a drink from a cup that looks like that. So we, as teachers, have to make sure that the student knows what the symbol represents, and if they don't know what it represents, then we teach what that symbol represents. Now, after we figure out the type of symbols that our students are going to use to communicate, students then have to have a mechanism for selecting that symbol. So what's the input going to be? And this is our means of access. So there's three different categories of means of access. Direct selection being the first, which simply means that there's a direct indication of what symbol is being selected. And this is done by pointing or some other mechanism the desired symbol or item. So this is the most simple and the fastest way to make a selection. The most common type of direct select is simply pointing. So sometimes students will have, let's say, a simple picture board in front of them. They'll point to what they want. Maybe it's a drink, and they've simply directly selected the item that they want. Now, keep in mind that pointing is not only always just done with our fingers, right? We have some students who direct select by using their toes, some direct select by using elbows, etc. So it just depends on that particular student. Sometimes students will use an additional device to point. So maybe they have a mouth stick. We have mouth sticks in the office. I'll bring those in and show you guys. Students might use their eyes to point. Okay, so there's different ways outside of what we traditionally think of pointing to use direct select. Um, a more sophisticated way to direct select would be using optical sensors. So some students use what we call a head mouse, and that head mouse will direct select objects for them. Some students use eye tracking, which is an electronic device that tracks the position of a person's eyes. Um, some students use speech recognition software or motion recognition software that will direct select items for them. Now, the second mean of access is scanning, which involves presenting choices to the student one at a time or in a sequential pattern, and then the student indicates their choice. So if you take a look in your textbook at page 231, there's different AAC scanning patterns represented in figure 8.7, so it shows you kind of what circular scanning looks like versus linear scanning versus row column scanning. So there's different ways that scanning can be done. There obviously are considerations with scanning. Scanning involves the use of a switch. So what kind of switch is that student going to use? Are they going to use a press switch, a pull switch? Are they going to use a puff switch? Basically, what kind of switch works best for that student and how are they going to use that switch to activate and stop their scanning. Looking at the switch activation methods, so how is the scanning going to occur? Are you going to do automatic scanning versus step scanning? And all these terms are explained in depth in this section of your textbook on page 230. And then finally, what's the scanning pattern going to be? The scanning patterns go back to that figure that I pointed out to you on page 231, which is 8.7. Finally, we have encoding, which gives multiple signals which taken together specify the desired item. So an example of encoding would be that E-Tran board I showed you earlier. So there's also an example of an E-Tran board in your book, and that's on page 229. So you can take a look at those examples as well as the videos that we watched earlier. So the E-Tran boards give different combinations of letters and colors, and together those symbols communicate what the student is wanting. So now let's talk further about different types of scanning. So you either have visual scanning or auditory scanning. So visual scanning is exactly what it sounds like. There are pictures that are presented visually to the student. So typically this is done by highlighting the pictures with a moving light, and then once the student sees the picture that they are wanting, they would press a switch or activate a switch to indicate that. Auditory scanning is where the student is listening. So as opposed to looking at the pictures, they're listening to choices, and then they activate a switch when they hear their selection. So look further at the scanning patterns that are on page 231 in figure 8.7. So if you take a look at the first two, we have an example of circular scanning and linear scanning. Okay? They're exactly what they sound like. So basically with both these types of scanning, each choice is highlighted and it goes in a sequential order with a visual cue. So the items will be either lit up or there may be an auditory cue that tells the student which item is being scanned. So with linear scanning, it works just like we would read. So left to right across the row and then down to across the columns and then down to the next row. With circular scanning, it goes around like a clock. So across, down, and then back across and up to the other side. So these are indicated, there's a visual to kind of help you to see this on that figure. Now with row column scanning, this is most commonly used if there's a group of items that need to be scanned. So what happens is each row is scanned as a group. So the whole first row is scanned, activated, and then when a student activates, so let's say the item that I want as a student is on the second row. So the first row lights up, the second row lights up, I would activate my switch, and then the scanning will go across the column. So I've indicated that the item I want is in the second row. I will then highlight across that column, and then once it reaches the exact item I want, I'll activate my switch again. Now lastly, with direct scanning, the student is actually continuously activating a switch until the item that they want is highlighted. So they hit the switch, it moves to the next item, they hit it again, it continues to move each time they hit the switch until the desired item is selected. So there's different ways that students can control the switch that they're using to scan and activate. So with their automatic scanning, is exactly what it sounds like. Each symbol is automatically highlighted one at a time, so it'll move at a sequential and paced pattern, and then select the desired item when it's highlighted. So the student is watching as it automatically moves from one item to the other, then they activate their switch to select their choice. Step scanning refers to pressing a switch each time. So the student is activating the switch, they hit the switch, it moves to the first item. They hit the switch again, it moves to the second item. Okay? And then it proceeds like that until they select the desired symbol and then they stop pressing their switch. Two-step scanning actually uses two switches. So one is used to move from item to item, and then another switch is used to select the item that the student wants. And then finally, reverse scanning, this is also known as direct scanning, is continuous switch activation. So the student presses and holds the switch until the item that they want is highlighted, and then they release the switch, which selects the item that they want. So let's talk a little bit about storage and retrieval. So some devices that are a little bit more complex are considered storage and retrieval systems. So devices might have different levels. So they might have different pages that the device goes to, or you may have some devices that have a static or a fixed display, but they have overlays that can change. So there isn't an electronic side of the device that technically changes as far as the display goes, but the overlay can be changed, which changes the message that the student is going to communicate. So we have picture-based acceleration techniques, which are essentially pre-storing messages under a sequence of picture symbols. So, for example, we might have a message where a student presses a picture of a person, they select the word eat, and that communicates the message, I'm hungry. We might have a student that would select a picture of a person waving, plus a picture of pointing finger, and the message that will be communicated is, hello, how are you? So these messages are stored within that student's device to be spoken when that combination of pictures are selected. We also have a dynamic display technique. So a device like a Dynavox, where the display of pictures is constantly going to change based on what the student selects. Some AA devices use abbreviation expansion in order to communicate messages. So there's two main types within this. We have salient letter encoding versus semantic letter encoding. So with salient letter encoding, essentially a code is derived from initial or visually significant letters in what the student wants to say. So let's say the example in the book that's given is if a student wants to say turn the radio on, they would type in TRO, and that would communicate the message, turn the radio on. Now with semantic letter encoding, specific letters are selected to represent words or phrases. So if, for example, if the letter H represents help and B represents the word books, if a student types HBN, the message communicated would be, I need help with my books, please. So again, with semantic and with salient letter encoding, these systems are developed by the people who are programming this device for that student to use. So they can be more specialized for items and phrases that student might be more likely to say. The student is then taught what each letter represents and how to use that system. In addition, we have other AAC devices that use more predictive techniques to convey their messages. So we have devices that use word prediction and devices that use letter prediction. With word prediction, the student types a word and then various word choices are displayed based on what was already typed. So the student might start typing the word when. Words that start with W will pop up, and when the student sees the desired word, they can select that word. Similarly, with letter prediction, the letters that are most likely to complete the sequence of letters that the student has already typed are displayed on a scanning panel for selection for that student. I'm going to show you a demo of a software called Co-Writer, and this is word prediction software that students will use when they're typing.
Just think and start typing.
Love. This.
Co-Writer helps you along. Co-writer gives you the words and phrases you're searching for as you type, even if your grammar and spelling are way off.
Painting.
And with topic dictionaries, you'll be surprised at your ability to write on complex subjects with challenging vocabulary. With 4 million topics available, from Alexander Graham Bell to Zygote, you'll never have a school subject that isn't covered.
The Mona Lisa.
Take those topic dictionaries and use Co-Writer in applications like Microsoft Word. Go to the web and write an email. Websites. Blogs. And Google Drive. The topic dictionaries you create and the settings you choose carry over when you pick up the next device, and the next device, at home, at school, or on the road.
So again, that was Co-Writer, which is a software that uses word prediction. As you can tell from that short little clip, really advanced software can be really helpful for students who struggle with spelling and grammar or just accessing computers to complete certain assignments. AAC devices have different outputs. So your output is either going to be voice, visual, or hard copy, or a combination of those items. So with voice output, devices either have digitized or synthesized speech. So digitized speech is more like a tape recording where a pre-recorded human voice is used. And typically that can be customized to a voice that would be similar to the student. So if you have a young female student, you can typically select a voice that would be the voice of a young female student to be similar to what that student's speech would sound like. Then there's synthesized speech, which is programmed into a device, and it's usually phonetically based. The nice thing about synthesized is that you can add new words in. And again, with the synthesized speech, typically there's a variety of voices that can be chosen from as well. So visual outputs vary from something as simple as a light or a highlighted selection that indicates the choice that was spoken. So you could look at the device and see that, okay, even though maybe I didn't understand the output, maybe I wasn't listening or it was loud, you can see what the student selected. All the way to devices that have a big display on top, and there's a section where the generated words or phrase or an entire sentence message can be displayed and you can see that. So devices like a Springform has that portion where you can read what the student said. And then with a hard copy, some AAC devices actually allow you to print a hard copy of what's being communicated. So a device like a Liberator, you can select and you can print that text that the student spoke. So once you've figured all that out, then you have to talk about how you're going to set your AA system up. So there's a lot of sensory considerations that go into this. You have to consider things such as symbol size and placement. Okay, so you want to first verify what size of symbol and letters the student can see. So you do this by matching. And if you look in your text on page 236, figure 8.9 gives a really good description of how you should go about doing this. Basically, you have the student match letters same to same. So you have a letter, and then you want to see if they can select the same letter from an array. And when they can no longer match the letter, then that font is too small for that student to see. You also want to test this with full words and sentences, okay, to make sure that, okay, the student can match the letter, but can they actually match a full word? It's also really important to consider spacing. So how close together can the symbols be on the system for the student? Sometimes it helps students to bold letters. If symbols or letters are not in a bolded font, it's sometimes more difficult to see. So bolding the letters is a good thing to try to see if that helps the student differentiate between the two. And then as far as arrangement goes, should you present the symbols and letters horizontally or vertically? And again, that's a sensory-based consideration by students. So you kind of have to do some experiment, play around a little bit to see what best suits the student that you're working with. Now, you also have physical considerations when determining how you're going to set up your AAC system. So now we've talked about symbol size based on what a student can physically see. You also have to consider your symbol size based on physical abilities. So for example, if you have a student who has very limited fine motor skills, you're going to want to make sure your symbols are big enough that they're able to accurately select the symbol they want. So if I have poor fine motor skills, I may be trying to select one item, but I may select the one that's right next to it if the symbols are too small. Again, that plays into the space between objects. You want to make sure that our symbols are far enough apart that a student is not inaccurately selecting a symbol because the symbols are too close and their fine motor skills are very poor. ROM is range of motion, so you want to make sure that your students' range of motion, they're able to access their entire system. Okay, so this is just a simple test that you would do by making sure that the student can select all the symbols on their AAC system. A slant board may be necessary to help a student better access their system. So here's a picture of what a slant board looks like. It's simply a board that raises up the system in front of a student. So if you notice, it's actually lays flat. It has a piece right here that helps prop it up, and this can be adjusted to make the slant steeper if that's what the student needs. And this is just something that can be helpful for those that have physical challenges as well. And then finally, positioning. Positioning is important, particularly when you're talking about kids with physical disabilities. So if a student has cerebral palsy and it greatly affects the left side of their body, you want to make sure that their AAC system is positioned in a way that they can access it with their right hand. Okay? It may be that some students require their system be directly in front of them. And again, this is just a consideration for something to take into consideration for every student when you're developing their system. We also have cognitive characteristics of our students that we must consider. So if we have students who have lower cognitive abilities, we're probably going to want to start with less symbols for those students. Students who have higher cognitive abilities, we may start with more. So again, this is individually tailored to the student that you are working with. Outside of just thinking number of symbols, this also applies to type of device. So you may start with a more simple device, a device that is easier to use, and then move to one that is more complex over time as the student learns how to. With a category-based format, symbols are placed together within categories. So for example, there may be a category for food, a category for leisure, a category for home, and typically symbols are arranged on the first page that indicate the categories, and then the subsequent pages will have display the symbols within each of those categories. Category-based formats do require that students understand the concept of categories. Secondly, there's an activity-based format. So within activity-based formats, symbols are placed together that will be needed for a specific activity. So symbols may be placed together for lunch, for art. Core vocabulary is selected. So these are words or phrases that are commonly used across those activities. And then activity-specific vocabulary is vocabulary that depends on a specific task. So for example, activity-specific vocabulary may be vocabulary all related to science class, whereas the core vocabulary would be words or phrases that the student might use across all activities in school. So common words for core vocabulary might include I want, more, no, restroom, help, words like that that are going to be words that students are going to use all throughout their day. Lastly, we have a theme-related format and language development-based format for arranging AAC systems. So with a theme-related format, this really can be used as a subset of an activity-based format. And a theme-related format is exactly what it sounds like. So all symbols related to a specific theme are grouped together. So maybe the theme of a holiday, so specific holidays such as Halloween. All the symbols related to Halloween might be grouped together and on the same page. Vacation might be another theme-related format category that you would use within that format. And with a language development-based format, this is organized according to syntactic strategies, so it really encourages the acquisition of new syntactic patterns. So your symbols are grouped left to right by categories of people, actions, descriptive words, objects, times, or places. And then when constructing messages, the student would select a subject, a verb, an adjective, and nouns, just like they would if they were writing a typical sentence. That's it for this week. Make sure you check your assignment for this week and upload to Dropbox, and let me know if you have any questions.